So here is our book. For those of you who haven't ordered the book, it's by Walter Brueggemann. And I'm going to read our focal verse from Isaiah chapter 9, and then we'll get into the handout that I've given you. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And tonight we take up the third of those four royal titles, Everlasting Father. The third liturgical title assigned to the newly coronated king in Isaiah 9:6 is Everlasting Father. At the outset, it is clear that the oracle is situated in a patriarchal society in which the father is at the head of the family or clan or tribe, exercises the most power, and has the most responsibility. To designate the king as father is to transfer the imagery of the family to the state, which of course suggests a hierarchical, patriarchal notion of power and authority. The modifier everlasting signifies a reliable steadfastness through time and over the generations, so that the phrase anticipates a reliable oversight of care, protection, and leadership. So what a father does for a family, look at these last three terms. The father is responsible for the care, the protection, and the leadership of the family. So when we apply the term everlasting father to a king, we're saying that the king takes on some of these same responsibilities. A king has responsibility for the care, protection, and leadership of the people of his kingdom. So, and this was very, very true in Israel. It might have been true in other kingdoms, but it was especially true of the expectations of kings in Israel. We talked in last week and the week before how this verse that was written in Isaiah 9:6 was probably written for the coronation of the new king Hezekiah when he had come of age and was being crowned the king of Israel. He was, these four titles applied to him, but would have applied to any new incoming king of Israel. So the king has responsibilities for his kingdom, kind of like a father has for his family. First, and Brueggemann has these, it is not surprising that. So we're going to look at a whole list of it is not surprising that. It's not surprising that in a patriarchal tradition, the father, as the final supervisor and guarantor of family life, should become an image for God. God is the supreme father, and therefore the progenitor or creator of all that is. In the extended lament in the bereft circumstance of exile, Israel will address God as Father. And this comes from Isaiah 63. For you are our Father. Through Abraham, though Abraham does not know us and Israel does not acknowledge us, you, O Lord, are our Father. Our Redeemer from of old is your name. So already in the time of Isaiah the prophet and in the time of the exile, it was already common to refer to God as our Father and Creator. So that was not something unusual as an image for God. And also in this same Isaiah 63, God then accepts this role as Father to God's people and says, for he said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely, and he became their Savior in all their distress. So that was written in Isaiah talking about God, how God had accepted the role as Father to Israel. If you have comments or questions, I invite you to jump in at any time and share your comment or ask your question. The expectation that a father would move beyond anger to mercy for his children is expressed in both Isaiah and in the Psalms. Psalm 103 is an example. God will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. God does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is God's steadfast love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far he removes our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion for his children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear him. For he knows how we were made. He remembers that we are dust. So many times, especially in the Psalms, we hear about God's anger, how God turns God's face away from us, God's children, because of anger or impatience, or because we are a stiff-necked people. We are stubborn in our disobedience. So the Psalms tell us that God can become angry with us, but also acknowledges that God cannot remain angry with us forever, that God's mercy overcomes God's anger, and God's mercy is everlasting. Our status as God's children is something that we are assured of throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and especially in the Psalms. So that's what we heard here in Psalm 103. The imagery ancient Israel finds adequate for God is not restricted to a one-dimensional patriarchal image. In Numbers 11:12, there are maternal images of birth, bosom, and suckling. We may conclude that there is both patriarchal and matriarchal imagery for God. God has a motherly inclination that makes hope for mercy both credible and welcome. So in the Old Testament, there's more imagery of God as Father, but there's also feminine imagery as God as Mother. And so Brueggemann wants us to know that in the Hebrew Scriptures, it was not a completely one-dimensional patriarchal view of God, but that God shares images. God shares characteristics of both mothers and fathers. Second, it is not surprising that in royal liturgical theology, the fatherly claims that have been elevated to be markers of God should then be drawn down to become features of the king who is seen to be Son of God. What do you think about this sentence that says that the king is to be seen as Son of God? That came as a little bit of a surprise to me. Did you have that understanding already that Israel's kings during the Old Testament times were seen to be sons of God?
I didn't cover a book I read recently, but it was kind of a new idea also to me at that point.
So I was thinking the king was anointed of God, which actually the word for that is what we use for Messiah. It's a Messiah.
Right.
So pretty special.
Like chosen, anointed, set apart. But I was not familiar with this Son of God kind of idea. I guess I thought that was reserved for New Testament and Jesus, but according to Brueggemann, Israel saw their kings as sons of God, that relationship. So the kings were to be sons of God, but the kings were also given attributes as father, like father of the kingdom. The king, God was the father of the king, and the king was kind of father of the kingdom.
Yeah, like the king is almost God's surrogate.
Yes. So we see over and over that characteristics of God get taken on by the king, so that the king is seen as wielding the power of God, and even like the prophets speaking for God to the people. So this is affirmed in Psalm 72, and I'll read this passage. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor. For he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. We talked a bit about this last week when we talked about the Mighty God title for the king, about how it was so important in Israel and Judah that their kings be responsible to the weakest in the society. And the scriptures affirm this many, many times over, that a good king of Israel and Judah will be a defender of the poor and the helpless. Protection of the whole family or the tribe is the work of God. Derivatively, it is the work of the king. For this reason, the new king coronated in Jerusalem is to be everlasting Father, the one who guarantees the well-being of the family, clan, or tribe, and eventually the state. The covenantal language of ancient Israel's faith recognized that society cannot prosper and flourish unless there is responsible attentiveness toward the needy and the vulnerable. How does this strike you? Is this new information for you, or is this the way you've always understood the responsibilities of the Old Testament kings?
It's new for me. New for me too.
I remember when I traveled to Greece and Turkey 20 years ago, when I was in seminary. So I went as a seminarian with other seminarians. And dogs and cats would come up to be fed out of our hands at mealtime when we were eating outside, and we ate outside a lot. Sometimes when we ate inside, but much more often outside. And I heard someone say something on that trip in the context of our sharing our food with the dogs and the cats, is that the real mark of the goodness of a society is how the weakest are treated. And in the view of that person who said it, that included the pets who lived on the street and who were dependent on the handouts of visitors and residents who sat at table outside, and the pets would come along to share our food. What do y'all think about that statement? The real mark of a good society.
I keep thinking how far away from that we are.
Yeah.
How far away we are
From a good king. A good leader.
Or from a good society. You know?
And a good society.
It's not just the king, but all of us. I mean,
right.
all of us sitting there as the cats and the dogs came by, we all made our individual decisions whether to share or not share. But the fact, I mean, I'm not used to this in America, having dogs and cats running free and, coming for a handout at mealtime. But I guess in other countries, it's not so unusual, and maybe in Greece, it wasn't so unusual. And everyone just kind of took their responsibility seriously to share what they had with those animals that lived off handouts.
Do governments have borders?
Yes,
They do.
governments have borders, countries have borders.
And to protect their people, is that correct?
or just to mark the border of where a government's authority ends and another government's authority begins.
But if people can cross over those borders, it's not a country.
I don't know. It depends on what country you're in, because every country gets to decide how their borders are defended, or how their borders are marked. You know, every country gets to decide if they're going to have armed guards at their borders, or if they're going to allow a free passage from one country to another country without checks. Every country gets to decide.
That reminds me of Mom growing up in Germany, you know, during World War II, when east side of Berlin and the west side of Berlin, and so East Berlin people knew what was coming, so all of them were trying to cross the border to get to West Berlin because they didn't want to live in the communist regime. Well, that's when the wires, the barbed wires and everything started going up, and you would see people on the east side of Berlin jumping out of buildings, running through the barbed wires, sneaking out in cars and stuff like that because they didn't want to be a part of. And Mom says that on her 21st birthday, that's when the Berlin Wall went up that separated them from one another. And she had cousins that were in the east side that she never did get to see again unless she got special permission, and then it was basically she had to be checked and searched and everything before she could go over there, and then she had to be checked and searched before she could come back because they didn't want her taking or bringing anything back. So, of course, in '89 when the wall came down, that was a very wonderful time for my mother and her brothers and everything. But yeah, talking about that territory, and that's what reminded me of that, the East and the West, and how they separated and put the wall there. So,
And they may have only lived 100 yards from their relatives, but weren't free to communicate with them. A wall.
The Old Testament's pretty clear. You shall treat the alien as one of your own.
Welcome
Yeah.
the stranger. Yeah. Well, think of the story of Ruth. When she came from Moab with her mother-in-law. As far as we know, she wasn't turned back because she was a foreigner. She was allowed to work in Boaz's field. She was recognized as a member of the family because she had married into that family. She was able to bear an heir, that was recognized as a legitimate heir, even though she came from a foreign country. So,
We welcome the strangers that blew up the Twin Towers.
well, they were enemies. They weren't just strangers. Some of them had come with the precise intention to do harm to our country. So even though we didn't recognize them as enemies in our midst, I would say as long as they were on our soil and contemplating doing us harm, they were our enemies.
So it's okay if you're not going to do harm across the border. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think, like I said, every country gets to decide how they're going to patrol their borders. And in our country, we change our government at least every 8 years. A new administration comes in, and a new administration has the opportunity to enact different policies, or to go to Congress and suggest different policies and ask for legislation to enact different policies. So it's almost like not even every country, but every government. And think of a government as ruling for a certain amount of time, like we would call it an administration. And an administration has the opportunity to say, we will enforce this, we won't enforce that. So,
In other words, they can not enforce a law that's on the books, is that what you're saying?
well, I think that they are, they do have to enforce law, but they, an administration does have certain powers to make decisions about enforcement, yes.
So they can just determine that it's okay for people to cross the border without going through the channel, the old channel.
I don't know. I don't know if they can do that. I know.
Every day.
I know that when Obama was our president, he introduced the idea of the dreamers and put forth a policy that said we would not, what's the word for evict, but it means to send back. We would not deport people who had come here illegally as children, that they would be free from the fear of being deported for a certain amount of time, and to give them a chance to, become citizens and not be deported. So I think that he did that by presidential action. Now, it wasn't permanent because later administrations said, no, we're not going to keep that policy in place. So, but every government gets to decide. So it can change over time. Let's see. Okay, I think we got to the middle of the page about how the covenantal language of ancient Israel's faith recognized that society cannot prosper and flourish unless there is responsible attentiveness toward the needy and the vulnerable. Thus, in the programmatic indictment of Ezekiel 34, who in here is already very familiar with Ezekiel 34? Okay. I taught my, maybe not this year, maybe it was last year, but I taught a leadership class to our session, to our elders, and some deacons too. And I kind of based some of it on Ezekiel 34 because I think it speaks so strongly as to what makes a good leader in biblical terms. But we're going to look at it. The shepherds, the kings, during the time of the prophet Ezekiel, are severely reprimanded for failure in the royal office that has led to the scattering or exile of Israel. God tells them they have not been good kings and points out to them, how they've been lacking. So here is some of that from Ezekiel 34. Ah, you shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat. You clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep. You have not strengthened the weak. You have not healed the sick. You have not bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strayed. You have not sought the lost. But with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And scattered they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep were scattered, and they wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. My sheep were scattered over all the face of the earth, with no one to search or seek for them. So here we have not only fatherly kinds of responsibilities for a king, but also shepherd-like responsibilities for a king. And that is the metaphor that's being used here is this is a shepherd with his sheep and talking about, you have not been good kings. You have not cared for my people. And you have not fulfilled your responsibility to my people, just the way a bad shepherd has not fulfilled responsibilities toward his sheep. The shepherd kings have not been father to Israel, but have engaged in self-indulgence to the neglect of the realm. We talked last week about empire, how the main motivation for an emperor is to exploit all the peoples and land that are under his control, that are in his empire. That's the way he accumulates wealth and makes it into the history books and, so forth. So an empire is about exploitation and rule and control so that they can exploit and increase their own wealth. So God is reprimanding the kings of Israel as if they have been acting like emperors. Well, they're not emperors. They're kings of Israel. They're supposed to be caring for God's people the way a shepherd cares for the sheep, defending the sheep, protecting the sheep. When the sheep get scattered, going and looking for them, gathering them back together because there's safety in numbers. And God is saying, you have not been doing these things, kings. You have not been fulfilling your God-given responsibilities. Only later in the oracle of Ezekiel is there voiced the prospect of a new king who will indeed do the fatherly work of kingship. And this is also in Ezekiel 34. God is speaking. I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God. And my servant David shall be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Okay. So David had been king generations. I don't know how many years or how many generations, but David had been king generations ago, before the time of Ezekiel. But David was remembered as a great king of Israel, the greatest king of Israel. So God is saying here, I will set up my servant David, probably more literally talking about, I will set up one from the line of David, from the lineage of David, to be a great shepherd or king over my people, who will care for the people the way a shepherd cares for the sheep. And then God sets up God over that king, saying that king is my servant, is my prince, and I will be king. So God is like saying, I'm going to have to take this over because my kings have been so bad and been so negligent. I will be king. I will be the shepherd, and I will set up one from the line of David as my prince underneath me. So that's the way Ezekiel sees the future. The anticipated king is assigned a crucial role, but it is a derivative role. It is prince, not king. It is as though the king, God, has in principle retained initiative and responsibility, but the prince, David, or someone from the line of David, is dispatched precisely to do the fatherly work of restoration. Third, and finally, it is not a surprise that the title of Everlasting Father does not work very well for Jesus on the surface, because we Christians have come to think of God the Father, the Creator, the Progenitor, Christ the Son, because we have called Jesus the Son of God for 2,000 years. So to call Messiah Everlasting Father seems to be a contradiction to the way that we normally see Jesus. So Brueggemann's going to address that for us.
Which I totally agree, because I mean that's like the one name in all four.
It didn't seem to fit.
It just doesn't
It's
fit.
like, okay, we're thinking, we've always thought of Jesus as Son, Jesus as God's Son. How is Jesus Everlasting Father? So that's what we're going to look at next. Even though Jesus is the King who will restore well-being. So here Brueggemann, I think, is saying that when we were in Ezekiel, and God was saying, I will set up someone from the lineage of David to be my prince. And then Brueggemann is saying, okay, Jesus fulfills that prophecy, because Jesus will be given the responsibility. It is Jesus the King who will restore well-being. After all, in the New Testament, Jesus addresses God as Father. For example, on the Sermon on the Mount is saturated with Father language that refers to God, and Jesus addresses God as Father in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven. Twice from the cross, moreover, Jesus addressed the Father, saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, and Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So all of these are assuring us we have good reason to think of Jesus as Son, because Jesus referred to God as Father. Given all of that, there is indeed a surprise. So he's been saying it's not a surprise, it's not a surprise, not a surprise. Now Brueggemann's saying this is a surprise. Were the care of orphans left to the Father, the Son would not be in the orphan business. But Jesus takes up that task that belongs to the Father. Jesus is in the orphan business. In John 14:18, Jesus addresses his disciples concerning his momentary departure from them. He says, I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is identified in the role of family making, family protecting, family generating Father. Jesus exercises familial responsibility like a father. In the synoptic tradition, the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are the three that are the most alike. They were the first three Gospels to be compiled and published and circulated. And John is the most different. So we call the first three the synoptic Gospels, and then John we call the fourth Gospel. Let's see. Jesus exercises familial responsibility like a father. In the synoptic tradition, Jesus famously says, let the little children come to me. When Jesus said in the synoptics, let the little children come to me, I always thought he was just talking about the little children, that their parents were bringing them to Jesus, because Jesus was known to be a healer and to forgive sins and to remove people's burdens, if they were handicapped or whatever. So people naturally brought their children, and the disciples said, no, he doesn't have time for all these little ones, get them away. And Jesus said, no, do not hinder the children, let them come. So I always took it kind of as a literal, Jesus was saying that into that particular situation. But Brueggemann says, no, Jesus was saying it as if we're all his children. Let all my little children come to me, and do not hinder the ones who want to come, be they blind or crippled or despairing or whatever. Let them come. Let's see. In the conclusion of Matthew, Jesus' promise to his disciples is, I am with you always to the end of the age. In the rhetoric of Isaiah, so now we're thinking back to 8th century Isaiah, that is a promise for all foreseeable generations, as if Jesus is speaking to all future generations of his disciples, of his followers, not just the ones he's looking at, but the ones who would believe because they taught and preached and baptized other believers. The paragraph in which Jesus utters his promise about those not orphaned includes an affirmation about the solidarity and identity of the Father and the Son. Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Now, this is from John 14. This is Jesus going away speech to his disciples in John 14. I'm going to a place where you cannot come now. Jesus is in such close identity with the Father, especially in the Gospel of John, that he shares these functions of a father. His love commandment is to enact the solidarity of Father, Son, and community. The everlasting part of it is that the church, over generations, has found the abiding presence of this fatherly God to be grounds for joy, for assurance, and for missional energy. So let's talk about the Trinity. We talked about it a little bit last week, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We identified that it was a heresy to think of Jesus the Son as being subordinate to the Father. So there were Christians in the early centuries of Christianity that said God is still the great God, the one God, and that Jesus is subordinate as Son. And when the doctrine of the Trinity was finally established as doctrine of Christianity, they rejected the notion of Jesus being subordinate and said that all three persons in the Trinity are of equal authority, that they are one God in three persons with equal authority. So none is subordinate to the others. So if they are equal, then is it easier to accept that, yes, we have known Jesus for 2,000 years as Son of Father God, but that Jesus actually, in his ministry to his disciples, took on some fatherly responsibility such that now we can see that God the Creator and Jesus the Son share responsibility for fathering the church, for loving us into redemption, loving us into forgiveness, loving us into accepting a call to do the work of God here on earth. So how do you feel about this? Jesus as a father to his disciples and to the church and to us in our generation.
I can see it easily as Jesus as the father of the disciples, because he took so much time with them, he taught them, he loved them dearly, and they respected him as a father.
Yes, I think so.
I don't have any problem with that at all.
Okay. So, everlasting Father, how does it sit with you as a title for Messiah? That's what the name of the book is, Names for the Messiah. So, we said initially, it doesn't seem to fit well for Jesus, because we've thought Jesus as Son. But Brueggemann says, Jesus took on some responsibilities of Father to...
You didn't mention that Matthew 23, 8 through 11. I'm just going to read that paragraph or part of it.
Okay.
In a curious note in Matthew, Jesus challenges three titles that are to be shunned in the early church. Call no one rabbi, call no one father, and call no one instructor. Father is a title of hierarchical force that may be appropriate to God as Father, but not to the Son or to anyone else. All right, now we're saying because of his actions, we attribute that to him. But what about that verse where Jesus challenges it?
I don't quite know what to do with it. I think it's curious that this one hits me a lot like the verse, and I can't tell you exactly where it is, where Jesus says, "Why do you call me good?" You know, we see Jesus as purely good. You know, in the tradition of the church, Jesus never sinned, that he was the only one who ever lived a completely sinless life. And yet Jesus looked at somebody who said, good teacher, and Jesus said, "Why do you call me good?" And here Jesus is saying to his followers, don't call anyone Father. Don't call anyone Rabbi, which means teacher. I'll tell you something else that it makes me think of. What was the term that Jesus most often referred to himself as?
Son of Man.
Son of Man. Do you know who else in the Bible is called Son of Man?
The kings were, weren't they?
They were called sons of God. I believe it was Ezekiel. Wasn't it Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones? And God speaks to him and says, "Mortal, prophesy to these bones." That word mortal, literally, if you go back to the original language, is Son of Man. So Jesus gets here, he adopts a title for himself, and it's mortal. Son of Man. Not Son of God, Son of Man. What do we do with that?
I personally rather like it. Because it makes him more real to
Yeah.
us as human beings who are very mortal.
Yeah. Well, and Jesus did die. I mean, that kind of my understanding of the word mortal is, I'm going to die. And Jesus died. So maybe it wasn't such a bad title for him to take. And he said, like, you know, call me mortal. I'm going to call myself mortal. He didn't take the title teacher. He didn't take the title rabbi, although, you know, people tried to call him that. But he called himself Son of Man, mortal. But maybe it shows the humility of Jesus. Now, this, you know, don't call someone else Father. Maybe he was speaking against setting someone up on a pedestal as if they are superior, if they're not.
I wonder if it could be a cultural thing, you know. I don't know back during that time if that their culture, you know, I mean, in our culture, it's yes ma'am, no ma'am, you know, and so when you live in the South, that's what you grow up saying. But if you live in the North, that's not, and people move down here and it's like you're being rude and disrespectful, you know, and it's like, no, I responded to you and yes, and that was, you know, and that's been fine with me when people would say, I'm so sorry, I don't, you know. But I was wondering if in a cultural aspect back then when Matthew, if that, you know, if we dug deeper, if it meant something else for him, not, you know, not to say, you know, I don't know. But it could have been not putting him on the pedestal, you know.
Right, right. You know, like the same thing when the man comes up to him and says, "Good teacher," and Jesus says, "Why do you call me good?" You know, maybe Jesus didn't want other people ascribing titles to him that he didn't accept himself. Maybe he was happy with Son of Man.
Yeah, but the rest of that sentence is, you know, why do you call me good? There's only one good, and that's the Father.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's making a separation there.
Yeah.
Right, right.
So, you know, John is the gospel that really sets Jesus up as God. The others, you know, they have some confessions, yes, Peter's confession, you are the Messiah. But the Messiah was supposed to be somebody sent by God. The Jewish people of Jesus' time didn't think of Messiah as God. It was a ruler, someone God would send and give power to that would deliver them from the power of Rome. That's what they were really looking for in a Messiah. So Peter's confession is more, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God, I think he said. And remember, they thought of kings as sons of God. So it's not until John, I think, we get Thomas's confession when Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." I'm pretty sure that's John. Anybody want to say, yeah, nay? But remember, there's an evolution of thought in the Jesus movement. We talked about this the very first week, that the earliest followers of Jesus, and we'll say members of the movement, the Jesus movement, didn't think of Jesus as God so much as those who lived 60, 70, 80, 100 years after them.
It wasn't left in the
Yeah.
that they thought that, started thinking that.
Yeah. And probably not really until, 40 years
Pentecost.
after that.
Or Pentecost. I mean, something happened in that room that made them willing to die
Oh,
for
yeah.
what they believed.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But it may have been, that Jesus is Messiah and you killed him. Peter preaches to the crowd at Pentecost and tells the story. He came, he taught, he forgave, he healed, he blessed, and you hung him on a cross. But he's talking more like Jesus as the Messiah of God rather than God incarnate. The God incarnate idea really comes in John. And that was probably 90 to 100 AD.
What about in Paul? Is it in Philippians where that pre-Pauline confession is? You know what I'm talking about?
yes.
And would that have been before John?
Oh, yeah.
Because okay.
Yeah. And that's it. Philippians chapter 2, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Jesus came down from God. Jesus
I keep
went back
thinking
to God.
about the scripture, but I can't remember exactly when one of the disciples, I'm not sure if it was Peter or John, but anyway, he said to Jesus, "Show us the Father."
Yeah.
And he said, "You see the Father now.
You see the
It's
Father
me."
in me.
He didn't say me, but
Yeah.
he was pointing to himself.
Pretty sure that's John 14.
Yeah. So that opened up something that a lot of people had never paid enough attention to.
Well, like I said, it was an evolution of thought. That idea came, I think, when the time was, when the time had come that Jesus' followers could say, yeah, that's right. He wasn't just Messiah. He was God incarnate. That prologue to John. And I don't have a Bible in front of me. May I? So this prologue to John, and I'll just read it, it's lovely. This wouldn't have been a prologue to any of the other Gospels because the thought had not yet evolved to this understanding, as far as we know, until John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and he dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have all we received, the grace and grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. And this is the record of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, Who art thou? And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And that means not the Messiah. And they asked him, What then? Art thou Elias? And he saith, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, No. And said they unto him, Who art thou? That we may give an answer to them that sent us. What sayest thou of thyself? He said, I am the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, Make straight the way of the Lord. And said the prophet Elias. And they which were sent were of the Pharisees. And they asked him, and said unto him, Why baptizest thou then, if thou be not that Christ, nor Elias, neither that prophet? And John answered them, saying, I baptize with water, but there standeth one among you whom you know not. He it is who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I am not worthy to unloose. These things were done in Bethabara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. And then it goes on to when John and Jesus meet and Jesus gets baptized. So it is in John I don't think the word is in there, but God incarnate is an idea that comes from this prologue of John. Also, the pre-existing Jesus is an idea that comes from the prologue of John. It does not appear in any of the synoptic gospels. It does, I think, appear in Paul's writing. That Jesus was with God before Jesus ever came to earth, and that Jesus went back to be with God.
Hitting on the thing that I've always stuck hard in my head. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Jesus, there's one place where it says we.
Yeah.
Christ was saying that.
Yeah, and that's what John says.
In other words, he was there.
Yeah, that Jesus was there.
That
now,
part is hard to think about, but good to know.
Yes. Now, I can't remember in what context I said it, but this language of the logos in Greek, the word, and the way John says it sets it up that the logos was with God at the beginning. In the Old Testament scriptures, it was Lady Wisdom, it was Sophia that was with God at the beginning. I think that comes from Proverbs. We're going back to your wisdom literature.
I
And
think it's
then
in Psalms too.
So it's in Psalms. So John takes some Old Testament language that referred to Lady Wisdom. Sophia is the word. I guess that's the Hebrew word or the Greek word. Sophia is Greek, isn't it?
Yes, wisdom.
Okay. Yeah, ruach in would. No, it's not. It's not. That's not the word for wisdom. I don't know the Hebrew word for wisdom, but Sophia. Anyway, John took that idea and said, "See, that was Jesus back then, that was with God at the beginning." So it kind of shows some of that evolution of thought during the first century. Do you want to hear the Philippians too?
Yeah, would you?
Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
That's not the one I was thinking of, but
Oh.
I don't remember where it is now.
Okay. It's 6 o'clock, but I'll just throw this out just for us to think about for another study. But the title Lord, that's an English word. That's not Greek. That's not Hebrew. It's in the Bible. It's in the English translations of the Bible, because that was the English word that best conveyed the thought, the meaning of the words that were used in the original languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word that gets translated most often as Lord is Yahweh or Jehovah. In the New Testament, which was all written in Greek, Lord is a translation of a different term, a Greek term. And I'm not sure. Do you know what it is? I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up. But we throw this word Lord around as if it means the same thing as God. It doesn't. It was just an English word that meant someone who had authority over a region, and he was Lord of that region. He might have been the landowner and had, servants and workers, who were under him, and he directed their work and whatever. So, but that'll be a discussion for another day. But thank you for being here tonight and for your attention. And we will finish up next Sunday, because we will have other things to be doing on Christmas Eve, yes. 2 weeks from today. But could you pass the Bible back to Karen? And thank you so much for coming. You're welcome to keep your handouts. If you don't want to keep them, give them to me and I'll recycle them.